So this is a paper with Mike Klausner, who's sitting there and will be sorry he's the one sitting and I'm the one talking, I guess, but we'll see. Okay, so what are we going to speak about stagger boards? It's a topic that's near and dear to the heart of many people here in the room. Suffice it to say in terms of background that over the past 15 years or so, there have been many hundreds of publicly traded US incorporated firms that have declassified their boards, often in response to predatory proposals. So just to give you an idea of the time series here, basically there was little if any action until 2003, and then all of a sudden, boom, declassifications mushroomed, and we have, as a result of this, a drastic drop in the incidence of stagger boards across the publicly traded firms that we will follow, but this is true across the board, right? So the incidence of stagger boards dropped from roughly 55 to 60% to about 35% in the sample of firms that I will be looking at here. This declassification wave was overwhelmingly supported by shareholders and particularly by institutional investors. So let's think of the big three, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. They have overwhelmingly supported both the predatory proposals and particularly the management proposals to declassify. So Michelle, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think BlackRock has supported about 95% of the management proposals to declassify over this period. So recent scholarly work suggests that this declassification wave had really harmful effects on firm value. And on the basis of the findings they report, they push for a series of governance reforms along the lines of first amending 14A to making it simply impossible for shareholders to push firms to declassify their boards through a predatory proposal, and second, hardwiring the staggering of a board through other governance devices. So what Mike and I will do in this paper is look a little bit more closely at the evidence and ask, okay, is that what the evidence really tells us? Is it really the case that this declassification wave destroyed value to such a staggering extent? No pun intended. So why does it matter? Before I bore you to death with a lot of granular fixed effects. Well, it matters above and beyond the question of whether the board declassification wave was harmful for two reasons at least. First, these things didn't simply happen. It didn't befall upon firms that they would declassify. A declassification typically takes two steps. First, shareholders often push. This would be the implicit step. It's not even one of the two steps I have in mind. Then the board typically moves for the charter to be amended so that the board is declassified. And finally, the shareholders need to approve this. So it's a two-step approach for the typical firm. This, again, didn't happen by accident to most firms. So if it's true that the declassification wave destroyed value at such a massive extent, well, we should be pointing our fingers at directors for simply bowing to the ill-informed will of the shareholders. And second, we should probably be reconsidering the role of institutional investors who currently hold the keys to American corporate democracy. So if they cannot get the answer right to a question that is as mundane, if you will, as the question, should a board be classified or not, how can we trust them to accurately decide whether they should be backing up, I don't know, an activist who's challenging the current management of a firm? That would be a much more nuanced and complicated question to answer. If they don't get the answer right for the board structure, well, I cannot even imagine how much harder it must be to get the answer right for harder questions. Okay. So before I move on to the discussion of the results, let me put my hands above the table and say what the spirit of the exercise is here. So neither Mike nor I really endorse Q as the best or even a plausibly good measure of firm value, right? We can have that discussion offline. But we will tie our hands behind our back, or one hand behind our back, and say, okay, let's stipulate that Q is really an accurate measure to look at to determine whether governance has a value enhancing or a value destroying effect on firms. And second thing, we are not entirely convinced, we are not as skeptical as some other people have been, but never mind that, that the declassifications were exogenous. So sometimes you hear the argument that firms may adopt declassifications because they know what's ahead, and they may simply move to make a governance change to appease shareholders going forward. Well, in that case, some of the stuff that people have reported, and even some of the stuff that we will report, will not be well identified. But we are skeptical that this is really the pervasive reason why firms are declassifying. So the spirit of the exercise here will be to, again, tie one hand behind our back and say, okay, let's stipulate that Q is a proper metric, and let's assume that this concern about exogeneity is not as strong as some people may suggest it is. Let's see whether the results out there in the literature are really well identified. That will be the spirit of the exercise. So toward answering the question, okay, what really were the effects of this declassification? We collected data on the board structure of basically every firm that ever touched the S&P 1500 over the past 20 years, roughly. We then matched so from that data, we constructed the board structure in a dynamic way. So for every year, we know whether any of those firms had a staggered board at that point in time. And then we matched that with standard accounting data, stock return data, and precatory proposal data from shark repellent. So first step in the analysis, we replicate a standard pool panel specification reported often in the literature. What do we find? That when we regress Tobins Q against a dummy for the presence or the absence of a staggered board, firm fixed effects and year and basically firm age fixed effects, we indeed find, as previous papers have found, that the presence of a staggered board is very strongly positively associated with Q. So if I have to put an economic number on that, this is roughly 6.5% of the average Q across the firms that declassified in the years leading to the declassification. So this is not peanuts. This is big money if it's true. If this is a causal estimate, it's a ton of money that this declassification wave destroyed. Why do I say destroyed? Well, again, since this is a within firm design, this is identified of the firms that switched. All of the firms that did a switch in my sample switched in the direction of declassifying. So the interpretation of this is when they declassified, they gave up the staggered board. Their firm value dropped by roughly, if this is again causal, 6.5%. It's a ton of money. So if I do a back of the envelope calculation, if these staggerings were undone among the firms that remain publicly traded today, well, if they would be able to recoup 6.5% of their value by undoing the declassification, that would amount to roughly $1/3 trillion. So again, not peanuts. However, there's a big source of concern that we will drill down on in our paper. So this is the picture I showed you so far. There was a massive drop in the incidence of this governance structure across the board. But the set of firms that declassified are not a random draw from the population of firms that had a staggered board. So some firms were much more prone to declassifying than others. We claim no originality to this claim. This is something that our colleagues, Ed Rock and Marcel Gahan, among others, had already documented. So it's simply a case, and it's a well-known fact, that larger firms, for multiple reasons, are way more likely to declassify than smaller firms. Why are they more likely to declassify? Two reasons, at least that we want to highlight. One is, arguably, if you're a very, very, very large firm, say Pfizer, right, the largest company in the world to have a staggered board in place at the point it declassified, you're probably not too concerned about the risk of being gobbled up by someone else through a hostile takeover. Who would take over Pfizer if they were to give up their staggered board? Well, probably no one, right? So that's reason number one. Reason number two is they are typically way more likely to be targeted by precatory proposals pushing for declassification, and we know that basically since Sarbanes-Oxley, since the accounting scandals, starting in maybe 2002 or 2003, firms became much more likely to actually follow up and adopt the suggestions of shareholders in the form of precatory proposals. So this is for the firms in our sample. We break them down into buckets: very large, large, small. So first of all, this is a fraction of the firms in each bucket that continued having a staggered board in place at each point in time. Who are the very large firms? Basically, firms in the top 10th decile of market cap in our sample. Who are the large firms? Firms in deciles 8 or 9, and this is the rest of the firms, which we simply arbitrarily call small. Some of those are not really small. They may be mid-caps. Good. So big takeaway from this is the very large firms declassified more and earlier than the rest. Why? Well, for the most part, for the two reasons I just invoked. First, they were probably not too concerned about being taken over in a hostile way. Second, they were being proactively being pushed by the shareholders to do so at a much higher rate. So for each year, you see the fraction of the firms at risk of declassifying, the firms that had a staggered board in place as of that point in time, that was targeted by a precatory proposal to declassify. Here you can obviously spot the inception of the shareholder rights project, which basically pushed for or filed precatory proposals or led to the filing of precatory proposals before roughly 1/3 of the firms at risk each year among the large and very large firms. So why is this a source of concern? Well, because at the same time as this dynamics in terms of declassification was unfolding, this is what was happening with the Q ratios of the firms in the different buckets. And the key thing I want to point your attention to here is this is a subset of the firms in each bucket. This subset consists of the firms that always had an annual board of directors. So the declassification wave arguably couldn't have played any or have had any impact on these firms, at least any direct impact on these firms. Why? Because none of these firms could declassify. They always had an annual board of directors in place. So what we see here is there's a very stark differential pattern in the time series in terms of how the Q ratios of the different groups of firms look like. For the very large firms, they first saw their Q ratios skyrocket, leading to a dot-com bubble, and then they saw them plummet. And then for the large firms, we see somewhat of the same dynamics, although somewhat more muted. And for the small firms, we don't even see the same dynamics in terms of the boom and bust. We see some bust here, right? But the main takeaway is this really, really, really wide spread between the three groups of firms tightened dramatically over time. And again, this cannot be accounted for by the declassification wave because none of these firms had a staggered board in place to begin with. They always had an annual board. So what was happening at the same time with the firms that did have a staggered board, you could ask? And again, I will recall that a moment ago I mentioned that the declassification wave only began at this point in the time series. Before there was little, if any, action in terms of declassifications. So let's focus on the firms that began the period with a staggered board in place also. And let's see how their Q ratios behave over time before the declassification wave kicked in. Key takeaway from this is, well, these guys, the ones we just saw, the very large firms with an annual board throughout, see their Q ratios behave in a very similar fashion, in a parallel trends fashion, I will say, as compared to the very large firms that began the period with a staggered board in place. Ditto for firms that are large. So here are the firms with an annual board throughout. Here are the firms that began the period with a staggered board in place. And finally, same thing for the very small firms. So this, of course, suggests one way forward in terms of sharpening the identification. How about if instead of simply comparing one firm with another firm in the same year, we compare one firm in a bucket with another firm in the same bucket in the same year? So that will be the key contribution in terms of identification that our paper will bring to the table. So what happens when we do that? Let me first show you the very coarse dynamics in the time series, then I'll show you some regression results. This is what happens. So just in the very same way in which they behaved in parallel fashion or in lockstep, leading to the beginning of the classification wave, I continue focusing on the same set of firms. I'm not letting firms drop out of a sample once they declassify. Once they declassify, I continue calling them firms with a staggered board because they began the period with a staggered board. So when we continue following the two groups of firms for each bucket over time, we see that essentially the two blue lines continue behaving in lockstep, the two red lines continue behaving in lockstep, the two green lines continue behaving in lockstep. So this basically summarizes the result of a paper. Now we will drill down in terms of the econometrics and show some regression results. The punchline here is once you compare apples to apples, once you compare firms with other firms of similar size, and hence account for these systematically different secular trends in Q ratios, the earlier findings that suggested that board declassifications were really, really, really harmful disappear. What do we think drove those results? Well, bear in mind that these are roughly 10% of a sample, the firms in the blue lines. These are roughly 20% of a sample, and these are roughly 70% of a sample, right? So who's the counterfactual in a naive regression analysis that simply controls for year fixed effects? For these guys, for the guys in the blue line, well, the counterfactual comes 10% from these guys and 70% from the rest, or 90%, I should say. So 20% from these guys and 70% from the rest. So that's essentially the story, the smoking gun we have in mind before we get to the regression analysis. So if our conjecture is right, upon drilling down on this a little bit more thoroughly, two things should emerge. First, a naive regression should lead to the result that most of the effect of the declassifications that I just showed you in a baseline analysis a moment ago should be driven by the very largest of firms. Second, as we can see from this, since the declassification wave began there, we should see a very stark pre-treatment trend for the firms that declassified. Finally, once we compare apples to apples, we conjecture the effect of the declassification, or the effect that we ascribe to the declassification, should be dramatically attenuated. So let's see if any of that holds up. First step, I will simply run a naive regression that basically breaks down the core staggered board dummy I showed you a moment ago into a baseline dummy, and then the interaction between the staggered board dummy and a large or a very large dummy. Again, the key thing and what makes this naive is we are only controlling for year fixed effects so far. What comes out of that? Well, this was the baseline design I showed you a moment ago. This is a new design. Takeaway, again, as conjectured, all of the effect is driven by, or most of the effect, I should say, is driven by the very largest of firms. Again, let's put a few dollar numbers on this. For intuition, let me skip this. Let's focus on this. So what's the t-stat for the sum of, the f-stat for the sum of that coefficient and that coefficient? It's roughly 0.62 with a p-value that is astronomically statistically significant. This amounts to roughly 29% of firm value. So if this is true, a back of the envelope calculation would suggest, so if this is a causal estimate, if these are causal estimates, a back of the envelope calculation would suggest that if these declassifications were undone, among the firms that remain publicly traded today of that set, firms would be able to recoup shareholder value in the amount of $1 trillion. So that should probably be the next question that the president should be asking Larry Summers. Okay, so what happens when we try to break down this and assess the dynamics? How did this drop in shareholder value come about? Well, we estimate a super simple leads and lags specification for each group. Again, the key thing is it's a naive specification. I'm only controlling for year fixed effects. We see a super stark pre-treatment downward trend for the very large firms, and we basically don't, which continues after treatment. And then we see pretty much nothing going on for the large and small firms in the sample. What happens when we instead adopt our desired, our chosen design and go from comparing one firm in the same year with another firm in the same year to comparing a firm in a bucket in a given year with another firm in the same bucket in the same year? We implement that simply through a slightly more granular version of the year fixed effect. That's just an interaction between bucket and year. So our bucket year fixed effect. What happens when we do that? Well, this is what the results look like. Our previous point estimate of 0.137, highly statistically significant, completely vanishes. And the point estimates we recovered before, in particular the one here that was like 0.7 something, well, it also vanishes. Key thing to keep in mind, the reason why the point estimates vanish is not because the standard errors are blowing up. The standard errors remain pretty much where they were. The reason why the estimates become statistically insignificant across the board is that the point estimates are dropping just dramatically. Another thing I would like to highlight, remember yesterday in the course of Charles' presentation, he made the very good point that even upon adding control upon control upon control, as the R squared continued to increase, his point estimates remain flat, remain stable. So that was a sign of health, right? That's typically what one would see, for example, in a randomized treatment study. Well, here we see exactly the opposite. Essentially, the R squared didn't change at all. It only changed by 1 percentage point or so as I went from using year fixed effects to adding bucket by year fixed effects. But the point estimates have dropped astronomically. So this is, well, as opposed to a sign of health, a symptom of something very, very unhealthy going on in the earlier specification. What happens with the lags and leads when we replace our year fixed effect by the slightly more granular version of the year by bucket fixed effect? Well, this is what you had before. This is what we have now. So we basically find no evidence upon comparing apples to apples of a significant drop in firm value in connection with the declassification. So I presented this at the beginning of the year in Israel, and Bernie suggested that I should look more thoroughly into how the firms reacted to the announcement that firms would take these actions. The first thing I did to... Well, sometimes I do. I have a lot of free time. So we gathered the data of the filing of the proxy statement filed by management where they asked for the shareholder approval to amend the charter and saw how the markets reacted to that. The answer is the markets didn't react to that. Of course, then we got the criticism, oh, no, you're not looking thoroughly enough, because really by the time management files the amendment proposal, I mean, the writing's on the wall. Everybody knows that the firm will declassify because they typically declassify upon being pressed upon to do so by a precatory proposal. Okay, we rolled up our sleeves. We got the date of a proxy statement that contained the first precatory proposal that the firm was targeted by a shareholder for the set of firms that were indeed targeted by a precatory proposal. Again, how did the market react to the announcement by the firm that they had been targeted by a precatory proposal? It didn't react. How am I on time, Henry? 2 minutes. Okay, I'm good. So a bunch of additional tire kicking exercises in the paper. We construct the size buckets in a more accurate way by using the stack cohort approach suggested by Gormley and Matza in their FS paper. The results continue to be the same. We use a nearest neighbor matching approach, again, being very careful about including bucket by year fixed effects in our specification. Again, the results continue to be the same as the ones I reported in the simple pool panel regressions. We also run calendar time portfolio regressions using the date of the declassification or the date of a proxy statement that announced that the firm would declassify as a relevant event. We also find nothing. Conclusion, well, the sky is probably not falling, right? So we should take with a lot of caution or skepticism results out there that suggest that the board declassification wave really destroyed value to such a massive extent. A small, if you will, methodological point here is we see more and more papers out there that use Q as the outcome variable and they run regressions with Q in a pool panel fashion. Well, people should be careful about how they run those regressions for multiple reasons that people have already discussed. Here we bring to the table yet another reason, right? They should be very, very careful about the possibility that secular differential secular trends in stock prices may affect some firms in the sample relative to others, right? And that may confound the estimation. That's it.
All right, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to discuss this great paper by my NYU colleague, Emiliano. So first, I'd just like to talk briefly about what staggered boards are. It's just a difference between the House, where you're elected every election, and the Senate, where you're turning over a third of the body every 2 years, kind of represented here by the Roman Senate. So this is kind of a classic debate that's been going on for many years now. Are staggered boards good? Are they bad? The argument that they're bad is the idea that, well, this is going to entrench management. It's, the point here is that firms have kind of been steadily declassifying themselves over time. There's another point of view that staggered boards actually provide a positive role by insulating firms against short-term pressures, by allowing them to have a higher bargaining position, particularly when combined with a poison pill that allows firms to really evade the possibility of a hostile takeover. And the IPOs these days generally have staggered boards as well. So this is kind of an ongoing live debate with large implications for corporate governance. And this paper, I think, makes a very valuable contribution to the debate by first showing the endogenous assignment of board destaggering and then developing a variety of panel regression techniques to try to address these and finding little evidence for the view that destaggering has really negative effects on corporations. So first, I'd just like to highlight the data. I think this is a really excellent data collection effort. So we start with companies that are kind of part of the S&P 1500 index from a long period. We're going to exclude financials and utilities. It's not clear to me why everyone excludes financial and utilities, but let's take it that the literature's been doing this for a while. We're going to continue to do that. Exclude firms with a dual class share structure. Merge all this with CompuStat. That's where we're going to get book values and other things necessary to compute Tobins Q. Ending up with a sample of about 2,200 firms, about 28,000 firm year observations. Then it's it seems like a very impressive data collection effort to actually compute which of these firms have staggered boards annually based on the hand collection from a lot of different sources of data, shark repellent, IRC, and the SEC. It turns out there are actually, interesting to me, a few firms that actually stagger their boards over this period. Those are excluded from this analysis as well. So we got a really nice data set to understand the question of how important are staggered boards for firm value. And the first kind of observation that Emiliana also pointed out is just the endogeneity in this assignment. Right? You can see that we kind of started out with a world where many firms had staggered boards. There was a steady wave of declassification over time that predominantly affected very large firms. So that kind of raises a natural endogeneity question that when we're contrasting the impact of having a staggered board or not a staggered board in, let's say year 2005, we're really comparing the very large firms with the smaller firms in that year, right? And so this sort of raises important questions of causal identification. So how does Emiliano tackle this? He's got three main strategies to try to understand this question. The first of these is what I think of as a literature replication. So this regresses Tobins Q on this AI term here is a firm fixed effect. Then we've got dummy variable for whether or not the firm has a staggered board in that particular year. Then we're going to include year fixed effects, various other controls, including controls for firm age. The next identification strategy I'll talk about is this event study by size group. So having established the relationship between size and firms staggering their boards, we're then going to run this regression for each size group separately. This allows the separate isolation of particular trends that are happening within each of these size group buckets. So the way I like to think about this is you just have a dummy that picks up the time from destaggering, and you're kind of doing a panel regression for each of those years before and after the destaggering event, also including these other controls. Now, normally in these kinds of panel settings, the firm fixed effect by itself would be a really powerful way to soak up a lot of unobserved variation. The problem here is the way in which the size group effects are manifesting themselves, right? So you've kind of have these differential changes in Q over time. They're impacting disproportionately certain firms of different sizes. And what that means is that even comparing a large firm before and after the destaggering, so doing the firm fixed effect and contrasting its effects prior and afterwards, is going to be insufficient because this differential effect in Q that's kind of going on, the secular long-term change, that's disproportionately affecting large firms. And so the way to address this is this cohort analysis, where basically we're now going to include some dummies to account for the fact that there are differential cohort time effects. And one nice approach is particularly by stacking these cohorts, so sorting them in the pre-period based on size and comparing kind of in a diff and diff what's going on here. So to briefly recap these results, the first replication study does find a very large positive relationship between staggered boards and firm value. So that's this kind of 0.13 coefficient here. So recall that firms are destaggering over this time. So a positive coefficient for staggered boards indicates that destaggering reduces or lowers value. This effect is predominantly strong among these very large firms. So this is, again, kind of consistent with some prior evidence. But then the event study really points to the role of taking into account the endogeneity that's going on here, right? I'm just kind of replicating the table that Emiliano also mentioned. I just want to highlight in particular this endogeneity demonstrated by the pre-trends, right? So this is before the destaggering wave happened. It's looking at the impact of Q. And you find this very large effect suggests that it's not a random subset of very large firms that are destaggering. It's those that are kind of exhibiting this pre-trend in which they have this declining Q for several years prior to the destaggering itself. And what that sort of indicates is that when we look at this very negative effect after the destaggering, that is potentially suggestive of some endogeneity going on, specifically within the very large firm cohort. Now, though these very large firms are small in the sample, they're quite large in market cap, so they're particularly important to study. All right, so then we move to this cohort analysis where it's kind of chopped off here, but there's going to be a cohort group fixed effect. The sample size is a lot larger because we're now kind of stacking and adding up a lot of firms, both in their treatment and control periods. And kind of the main punchline is once you do all that, you now kind of also recover a relatively small coefficient for the staggered board dummy. indicating that once you control more cleanly for what's going on with these cohort effects, you don't find a strong relationship between the staggered board and firm value. So I think this is all kind of really impressive, great work to put together this data set. I think this is very carefully done empirical analysis. And I think it's quite convincing in showing that some of the prior work that found really large negative effects might be overstated. So what I'm going to do, the remainder of my discussion is talk a little bit about the magnitudes of what these results imply. I'll complain about Tobins Q for a bit, and then I'll talk about what I think is the ideal specification. So first, I'm just kind of plotting some of the different estimates taken from this paper. And I think one of the main themes of this paper is the difference between some of the cohort estimations and the standard firm fixed effect specification. So, Emiliano really emphasized the fact that once you do this sort of size or cohort size group year, adding all these granularity in the specification, you really kind of move down the point estimate, and you now have 0 within the 95% confidence interval. I think these are all great points, but I think it would be also useful to emphasize the estimation error, right? So if you take kind of the preferred specification, or what I took to be the preferred specification, you actually cannot rule out that there was a 290 billion destruction as a result of destaggering, or a gain of 226 billion. So that's using the same kind of back-of-the-envelope calculation, taking these kind of point estimates and scaling them up. So that sort of suggests sort of a fair amount of imprecision, even in applying the most granular estimates. I think just be good to have a little bit more discussion in the paper on not just the point estimates and magnitudes, but kind of broadly the standard errors behind those estimates. I had some fun looking at the literature. So this is the year of publication of the papers, and this is I tried to take kind of a standardized estimate, the impact of staggered boards on Q. So I'll complain about Q in a second, but one nice thing about the fact that everyone runs the same regression is you can kind of contrast the literature's estimates over time. And so you see some of these earlier estimates here finding very large negative effects of staggered boards on Q. Then you've got some of this more recent work that finds very large positive effects, so suggesting that the staggered board declassification had really large value destruction effects. And then you've got kind of this paper here sort of sitting in between sort of these two literatures. And so, aside from the fact that, 0 is kind of within this confidence interval, I think it would also be helpful to have a little bit more discussion of how the kind of range of errors behind these estimates kind of contrast with those in some of the prior literature. All right, so here's a question. So this is a company. This is a price to book ratio from 1990 to today. So price to book, not quite Tobins Q, but close enough. So you see from this period, market to book went from 1.7 to 1.4-ish. So who thinks this was value destruction? Anyone thinks this is value destruction? No one? Okay, good. Because this is Berkshire Hathaway. Over this period, you had 3,800, a dollar invested in this would be returned 38-fold to that of investing shareholder, right? So, but this is what Tobins Q measures. It looks for changes in this kind of market to book measure, assigns any increase to improvements in firm value, assigns any decrease to destructions in firm value. But you can see from this example that's entirely unconnected to how shareholders actually benefit from their investment in the company. So just to be clear, I don't blame Emiliano at all for using Tobins Q. It's the standard in the literature. I understand you're innovating enough as it is. You want to have some degree of comparability with the literature, but just exactly as Emiliano's kind of agenda is to kind of kick the tires of this whole literature, I thought it'd be worthwhile in my discussion to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the limitations behind this Tobins Q measure. So first of all, notice how you measure this. So you take price, multiply by shares, add book value, subtract of assets, subtract the book value of equity, divide by the book value of assets. You arrange around a little bit, you get market value of equity, book value of debt, over book value of equity, book value of debt as well. Right, so first of all, remember what we're trying to do with this Tobins Q measure. We're trying to get on the top some estimate of market value of assets divided by some element of replacement cost. As proxies for this, we've got at the top book value of debt And at the bottom, we have not the replacement cost of assets, but other measures of book value. And this is all kind of very odd to me because we already have the firm value in here. It's right here. The value of the firm is the market value of the equity. But we're kind of taking that estimate and just adding all this other stuff that really doesn't have too much to do with the assessment of firm value. So I know that everyone knows Tobins Q is really a bad measure, and I know that people are using it anyway, but I really just want to emphasize the lack of theoretical or empirical reasons to interpret this value as a metric of firm value. So theoretically, what is Q? We know this from sort of the macro literature that it's intended to be a relationship that predicts investment for firms, right? So firms actually maximize value when they set their marginal Q equal to 1. This is the same as the average Q, as Hayashi pointed out, when there are quadratic adjustment costs. So what that means is in the time series, you're going to get kind of some stationarity with this Tobins Q measure, right? And in particular, firms are really maximizing their value when this Q in general is going to getting kind of close to 1. So whereas the literature is assuming that kind of higher Q is associated with higher firm value. So that it has really bad time series properties. In the cross-section, firms have different values of Q because they have higher growth options, because there's greater value coming in the future, because there's a lot of intangibility of capital, right? We know that the majority of assets these days are intangible, reflecting patents, innovation, and so on. And that's going to result in cross-sectional differences in price-to-book ratios that have nothing to do with measurements of firm value at all. Furthermore, book-to-market, the inverse of this thing, is a priced risk factor. What that means is higher Q is associated with lower returns going forward. So I think this point is really well known in particularly the finance literature. Tony White in particular has a number of papers pointing out all the measurement errors that go on, the aggregation issues that go on with Q. But I'd like to point out that this, there's another paper here, Bartlett, that sort of also complains about this. I really just like to emphasize that I don't know why precisely this literature has focused so much on Q as a metric of firm value, especially given that you have firm value right there. If you look back, why do people do this? It turns out Schleifer wrote an article once in the 80s. He actually had replacement costs on the bottom. He actually had market value of debt. He mentioned some of the limitations behind the measure. Then at some point, people substituted in the CompuStat values and just kind of went with it. So I just want to emphasize nothing to do with your paper, but I just thought I'd take a couple minutes to complain about this anyway. So how should you think about firm value instead if you accept that there are all these limitations to Q? Well, you can just use, in this case, returns to shareholders. I think that's a pretty good proxy. So what I'd suggest doing in a specification like this is do a two-stage regression. First, kind of control for all the risk factors that impact returns. Why is this important? Well, remember on Monday, Roseanne was canceled. Disney lost 2.5% in its share value. Is that a bad day for Disney? Well, the market went down by 2% that day. So it's a little hard to tell. What this kind of does is account for these broader market trends in cleaning up the return regression on that first stage. And then I would do some kind of panel regression where your controls can include, for instance, the cohort group effects or something like that. I think the other kind of event study that approach that might be helpful here is just select on all the companies that have ever destaggered their boards. So rather than comparing cross-sectionally between companies that have a staggered board and don't have a staggered board, just look within only those that have destaggered their boards and use as a variation in the timing of when this happens. I think that's another clean way to try to better estimate the causal impact of board destaggering. There's also this paper here you may want to look at that shows how to do inference when you have pre-trend. So specifically on that large firm sample, there may be a way to back out further what are some of the causal effects. So just like to conclude, that was a great paper. It makes use of really interesting data. I think it makes some progress on a substantial old question that still has enduring relevance. And it really is convincing, I think, in suggesting that some of the effects that this literature has estimated in the past are kind of contaminated with various forms of identification problems. I really suggest you read the paper. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Here's Emiliano.
Actually, Lucia
So I just want to say thanks, Arpit, for super thoughtful comments. So I agree that we should probably put more emphasis on the estimation error thing. Q is wrong. Well, Arpit, what can I say? You're preaching to a choir. but as I said, the spirit of the exercise was let's tie one hand behind our back and let's see what we can make out of it. Third, you suggested two things we should do there. In fairness, the paper that's posted doesn't include any of that. Over the past few days, I have actually run something very much in the spirit of one of the two things you suggested, namely the one in which I see how basically alpha builds in connection with the declassification. I didn't do it quite in the same structure using the same structure you suggest there. I should look into that. I simply run a calendar time portfolio analysis following, so building portfolios, I think 6 months before the declassification proposal was submitted, and then following them for 2 years after the declassification and seeing whether any alpha builds in connection with that, both across the board and within bucket alone. We didn't find anything. But thank you. I'll follow up on the suggestions.
Okay, question from the audience.
Scott? Okay, you pick it.
So governance can impact value through the propensity to be taken over. And I guess if you're taken over, your Q is no longer in your sample. So you might want to think about that.
Fair.
Maybe if you look at total shareholder returns or something like that, you could include dividends and
Yes. So
takeover
I agree. One thing that I found striking, probably people in the audience will be fully aware of this, is the rate of attrition is dramatically different across the different buckets of firms. So very large firms are very, very unlikely to leave the sample. Hence, I infer they are very, very unlikely to be acquired. So if there's any problem regarding acquisitions in terms of contaminating the estimate, it's mostly driven by the smaller firms. But I agree that it's something we should focus on more closely.
Yes, I have a very similar question. In Staggered, boards are really about proxy fights and keeping the hedge fund activists out. You haven't mentioned proxy fights and hedge fund activists. Is maybe the relevant comparison group, I mean, the bulletproof dual-class firms that, don't care about hedge fund activists? And, has the propensity of getting hit by hedge fund activism or a proxy fight increased with destaggering, basically?
So I do not know any statistical evidence regarding that question. So I don't know if there's a stylized fact suggesting that upon declassifying, or even in the cross-section, firms with annual boards are more likely to be targeted by activists relative to firms with staggered boards. The one institutional wrinkle I'll point to, however, is that typically proxy fights come in the form of a short slate. Why? Well, because that makes people like BlackRock more likely to support the challenger, right? So in that regard, if you're only nominating, say, one person, Pels against Procter & Gamble, right? In that case, whether the board is staggered or annually elected probably is second order. So I wouldn't overblow the claim that board structure has a lot of effect on the propensity to, direct effect on the propensity to be targeted by an activist.
So I like a lot the first part of the paper. I think it's a good way to revisit the Kremer's study and so on. And when I read that study, I felt like there's probably a large firm effect. So I'm glad that actually you did that. I got a little confused in the second half of the results you presented, because the first half was more about there's a methodology out there, it has problems, we can't infer much from that. Mm-hmm. The second part kind of seems to go to the direction that you conclude that there is no effect because you go and check the proxy filings and so on. And people have done that before, and I think we have two of the co-authors here of the paper that says proxy filings are also useless because they're anticipated. Very often the proposals, list of proposals is known already 3-4 months ahead of time because the activists publish the companies they're going to target. Many of these proposals are already submitted the year before, so it's the second, third time, like Bristol-Myers said it for 6 years. So we know proxy filing dates are not good, and they're contaminated by other information in proxy filing. That's why Vicente and Mireia did a study looking at the stock price reaction around the threshold when proposals pass. That seems a very neat and clean way of getting to this question. So I was trying to get a sense from you. Is your take that we can salvage the Tobins Q literature because it has some potential benefits over that approach, or was that just to say, okay, that paper is wrong, and so let's rely on the more clean evidence that we already have,
So, multiple things to say. So first, the reason I put forward the evidence related to stock returns in connection with the filing of some proxy statements was, well, simply we want to see some more evidence. That's it. I'm not seeing this as conclusive evidence of anything, simply as consistent with the finding we report, namely that in the Q panel regressions, once you compare apples to apples, there's not a lot of evidence for anything. Second, I'm not sure about what you mean by activists publish whom they are going to target ahead of time. First of all, predatory proposals are not filed by hedge fund activists. They are typically filed by gadflies, so Cheverin and...
Clarify that the shareholder proponents often present a list of companies they're going to target during the proxy season already months in advance. For example, proposals to expand stock options and so on. UBC came up with a list of companies. And some of these proposals were presented the year before already, right? They're there 3-4 years in a row before they get approved. So I'm just saying proxy filing, we know that they're not good. So I expected to find nothing there, and then you find nothing. So my question fundamentally to you is your goal to try to find the best way to assess the value effect of Tobins Q, through Tobins Q, and if so, you believe it's better than do a regression discontinuity design around proposal, or it was just to say that approach was wrong, let's not, put emphasis on that.
What's the best approach? Probably a scattershot approach that includes multiple ways of looking at the same question, hoping to find a consistent account. Ideally, when I see papers that focus exclusively on Q, what I'm asking myself is, okay, what if you had run the portfolio time analysis? Would you have found similar consistent results? And I find myself, concerned when I don't see any mention of that. What can I say about Mireia and Vicente's paper? It's a super interesting approach at tackling the same question. Now, if my memory serves, I've read that paper 4 years ago. I do not know if they report results pertaining in particular to declassification proposals. So I know that they disentangle some categories of proposals relative to others and that they find consistent results across the different buckets, but I don't know if they go fine enough in terms of their bucketing. Vicente will remind me.
There's not a lot of power once you go to smaller proposals. I think this is one in which we have hope, and the results, I think, were consistent with our main results, but we decided not to report them because we don't know if we have enough power. So the answer is maybe, but we didn't report it intentionally because we thought we were not sure, and we prefer to stick to what we know for sure.
Okay.
I think that's what I had a question that was also actually related. So, I've been bagging on a one-to-one basis in the coffee breaks everyone how much I dislike Tobins Q. So I thought I would voice it, in general. I'm really aligned with the discussion in terms of, the summary of all the problems that Tobins Q have. I think your paper is very elegant, but in a way it's a forensic approach to what went wrong in this particular paper that finds something with Tobins Q, but in particular, I think every paper that finds something with long-term effects of Tobins Q, there must be something going wrong somewhere that identifies the effect, right? And it's not only the pre-trends of Tobins Q that bother me, it's the post-trends that bother me, right? If markets are efficient, there shouldn't be a post-trend. And if markets are not efficient, then we can go do something else, let's not write papers about these things anymore, right? So I think there are better approaches. I think focusing on returns, it's a good idea. I'd like to just make a point. When you focus on returns, if you do a power test, suppose that the effect is, say, 5%, it's a big effect, and your sample is a couple hundred staggered boards, how far you can go in time, 1 week, 2 weeks, a year, 2 years, such that you have power to say something? And the answer is not much, maybe a month. To look at long-term effects, we cannot do it with these sample sizes. Even we don't have enough precision to benchmark what's the normal return. The abnormal return is too noisy, right? So we just can't. If you have a couple of thousand firms, you can look a year ahead. If you have a couple of hundred firms, you can look a week ahead. You can do an event study, and that's fine. That's the measure of our ignorance. But I think we shouldn't. It's nice to look at long-term effects, but if we can't, we can't.
Nothing to say about that. As I mentioned to Fabrizio a moment ago, I'm skeptical whenever I find a paper that only reports results that have Q on the left-hand side. I always wonder, why only that?
So just a few things. One is, do you reform the deciles, because that's a survivorship issue, or do you keep the deciles constant? Second thing is industry controls. So I'm also, as you know, partial to stock returns and not Q. But I would have said sort of in terms of your interpretation, you focus on, to make your paper bigger, I want to just focus on the Seppi and Kramer saying it destroyed value. It also doesn't seem to, if you look at your pictures, it has no effect on value, right?
Yes.
So this is, okay, it's Q, but we could also say this is governance. That particular governance doesn't affect it. I would, though, encourage you to do what your commentator said, because you want your paper bigger, so you want to look at some other method of valuing them. And then you can say something more about those things. But
So-
industry close is a standard thing, because we know governance varies with industry. And one other thing, in your description of large versus small, also the ownership, we know why they have more proposals. It's because they have more institutional investors than small firms and less inside ownership. So that's another reason for finding that you could put in for the disparity in your decile.
I just want to echo the comment on returns. So when you run these regressions on returns 6 months, a year, 3 years, it makes a difference whether you're using the Fama-French momentum factor or the cohort factors. The results change. Martin and I did a paper where if you do time-varying betas at the firm level, the results change. So I'm just echoing the comment that these 6-month, year, 3-year returns are, I think, have equal problems, problems equal to Q. So I think probably the cleanest is the event studies where you have a day or a week.
Yeah, so I have some also dissatisfaction with the staggered board literature, and one thing that really bugs me is no one ever talks about what the staggered board actually does. And so I guess one thing maybe that might be interesting in your context, I mean, if you think about it, so the fixed effects, I think they address one particular problem, but I'm not sure, do they address the reverse causality problem? Because you would think that, if it's really going to decrease value so much, then the managers are not going to declassify, right? So, but if they declassify and it doesn't change value, maybe they've done something to actually sort of replicate the staggered board. I mean, maybe you can make a change to the board that avoids the negative effects of the destaggering, because they must have had a staggered board for a reason, which no one ever talks about. And so what are those reasons, and can you see whether the board changes around the destaggering that might actually add some richness to this discussion?
So my more senior law colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's no way short of putting in place a dual class share structure or something like that to substitute for the protection, if any, offered by a staggered board. Honestly, I don't think they are doing anything else of a similar magnitude to compensate for the waiving of a board, the staggered board structure. There was something else in your question. Can you remind me, please?
Well, so I guess I had a question about the staggered board, because it's not just about protection from takeovers, right? It's also about continuity in the board. Right, so if you set up a new organization.
Yes. So
right?
that's the funny thing. This, of course, it will be dirty in all sorts of ways, but I looked at the rate of turnover in boards of different structures, and it's essentially the same. You could reply, oh, it's the same because they are behaving differently in ways such that, in the end, what we observe in equilibrium is a similar turnover rate. Maybe, but in the end, all I know is the stylized fact that their turnover rates are not different across different board structures, and that and in fact, they are very low, typically in the order of maybe 5% per year, 6% per year. And that, if memory serves, when I looked at this in a within-firm fashion, if anything, the turnover rate dropped somewhat for the firms that declassified, just 1 or 2 percentage points.
They drop
Yes.
Sort of makes sense, because then you preserve the continuity on the board, so you have less turnover.
So let's think of a naive model. If the declassification, if having an annual board makes it more likely that the board will turn over, we should see the opposite of what I found. Upon declassifying, turnovers actually drop slightly. Declassifying.
So they get reelection every year, but then the same people get onto the board. Isn't it?
Yeah, so there's.
Yeah, that's.
So, but we can talk about this.
Follow up on
Let's move on.
next point. Why do firms even have this? The reason is nowadays they have it either because they adopted them midstream 20 years ago or because they went public with them. Why would they want to go public with them? My guess is there's a little bit of an option value. You know that either you have it at that point or you can never have it. And probably even firms going public today, they are not meaningfully punished in terms of the price they fetched at the IPO stage by choosing a classified board structure. That's my guess, but again, we can discuss this offline.
Hi. Can I just make a quick comment, absolutely in response to Renee's point, because I think it is a really important issue. Everybody talks about staggered boards as if they are the main piece of the puzzle, but of course what they're disguising is a very US-specific issue under Delaware law, that there are different rules for staggered boards and non-staggered boards regarding removal of directors. If it's a non-staggered board, you can remove directors any time you like without cause. If it's a staggered board, you can only remove for cause, which means they're insulated for the full term of their staggered boarddom. Now, when you look outside the US, you see staggered boards all the time, but they don't work the way they work in the US because the legal regime behind them is different. And so Australian companies have staggered boards all the time to get exactly your point, Renee, the continuity, but it doesn't work the way a Delaware company works because the shareholders have an absolute right to remove the directors at any time, irrespective of them having a term. In the UK, you can do the same thing. Shareholders can remove the directors at any time. They have historically had staggered boards as well, but that's now discouraged under the corporate code, the corporate governance code. So I think that's the key. It's the legal regime in Delaware that flips the rule for removal of directors.
For those of us in the audience who are not econometricians, one of the unusual things about the Kremer-Seppi's paper was the vigor with which they made a normative claim. That is, their data supported a conclusion that essentially, to them, persuaded them we should impose something on them. So, and one of the things listening to the remarks were that the sample size for something like staggered boards may be too small ever to tell us anything econometric about the normative claim. So those of people who are advising companies, people who are writing codes and the like, is there one takeaway is that it will turn out to be entirely contextual. That is, whether the continuity of board makes any difference in a particular setting will depend on the peculiarities of not just of the industry, but what's going on in the industry at this point. It's in some circumstances, continuity of board will be a terrible thing because they're too old, they're not diverse, they don't think about their industry the right way. Other times it will be better. So having listened to this wonderful conversation, I walk away with the notion, with the conclusion, I think, that there isn't anything, that when all is said and done, policymakers are left making the same kind of non-empirical judgment that they often do. And I wanted to raise it just because what it then does is tell us it's not an empirical question. It's a judgment question based on a rough call about a lot of things because given the sample sizes and the like, we can't do the econometrics that would give us a powerful normative statement.
So what to say about that? I think that the remarks from some people in the audience were not that you cannot do econometrics, period, only that you should be very careful and that there are limits to what you can do with econometrics and to what magnitude of an effect you would be able to tease out, right? So maybe we'll look at things using the best tools within our reach and we find no evidence of anything. Then we may be left with the conclusion you suggested, namely, well, this is context specific, this is firm specific. I would be curious to know how the big institutional investors are handling this, because it's a key question.
So, I'd like to comment on your comment and split it into two different parts. Sometimes we don't have the power or the right variation to identify whether one thing goes one way or the other, and then we ignore it, and hence we shouldn't make policy statements, right? But that's one statement, and I totally agree, and we should be careful about what we say in our papers, exactly what our variation identifies or not. Even when it's causal, it can be local, or it can be on the margin, or the different margin. That's a very important point. But I think there's another point that I would like to challenge. I think econometrics is always on the average, right? And we can make policy on the average. It's going to be, I know reality is case specific. Econometrics is about averages, it's about conditional means, right? Like drinking and driving is bad on average. Some people arrive happy and earlier home, and it's fine for them, but we cannot regulate for those people. We regulate on the average, right? So still, if an econometric paper soundly says this thing is on average bad for firms, we could decide to regulate or not, but it's informative about regulation, even though for given specific cases, we're actually making a mistake, but that's as much as we can do.
One quick response. An average, we're basically dealing with a relatively similar set of circumstances and the variances. If most people have some percentage of alcohol, we're reasonably confident within a range based on the biology of how the alcohol is processed. So there's not a lot of variance, and using an average won't create much of a problem using the econometrics. And this isn't an anti-econometric claim. It's just that there are a set of circumstances where there's variance in the sample, when there's industry variance in the sample, when there's strategic variance in the sample, where the average, on the one hand, may not tell you very much, and on the other hand, people are making real decisions based on the information they have. And so one interesting question is, given the constraints on doing it, you guys still know more than most of the policymakers, given what they have. So given the constraints on the econometrics, what would you do? That is, some people are making judgment calls, and you guys know more about this than everybody else, even if the vice doesn't quite close. So are there judgments you can make given the limitation on the data that will still be, it may not pass a journal reviewer, but real decisions are being made on standards different than a refereed journal. What do you walk away from the exercise thinking about?
My takeaway is twofold. One is, first, we should be very humble. Second, the best approach typically entails a multi-pronged way of looking at the data, right? That's what I can get away from this. I completely agree with you that, say, when Vanguard or BlackRock and so forth need to vote on this, they cannot wait for a perfectly identified research design to come up. They need to decide whether they support this proposal now, not wait until the JF finally decides to admit this paper or another, right? So what are the best tools within their disposal? Well, the ones that hopefully all of us together will be able to put on the table for them.
Okay, I think we're going to just end there and go on to our next paper by